Hi students, it's Dr. Marks, and we're talking about institutions that are important for prosperity. What are institutions that help a country be more prosperous? When we look at the world's economies, we tend to ask ourselves three common questions. Why are some nations wealthy while other nations are poor? Second, why are some nations getting wealthier faster than others? In other words, they're on a trajectory that's just moving along much more rapidly. And finally, can anything be done to help poor nations become wealthier? Well, if you were a development economist, these would be the kinds of things you would be spending your time thinking about, researching, and trying to craft solutions that might help the world's most poor nations. We know that even within continents, we see differences, and Asia is a great example. Asia has one of the richest countries in the world. By now, I'm hoping that you can tell me what country that is. Singapore, very wealthy country. But Asia also has some of the poorest countries in the world. And you can probably tell me which of those countries are poor. In Southeast Asia, of course, we've talked a little bit about Burma and Laos and Cambodia. So just looking at GDP per capita, remember we need to look at a per person basis, that gives us our proxy for income. Even when we look at that measure, we see within a continent we can have very huge ranges. We also know that Asia has some rapidly developing countries. Well, Malaysia and China have been very quick to develop. At some point they just kind of took off and they've moved away from the pack. In this lecture, we're going to focus on things that economists know impact growth and prosperity. And we call these things institutions. A country is only as strong as its institutions, and we'll be defining that formally and talking about specific ones. Let's think about what the world actually looks like, because there are three key facts that we can hang our hat on that are absolutely true. First, if we look historically, everyone used to be poor. Well, if everyone used to be poor, how is it that some fared so much better than others as they developed? Second, today when we look at GDP per capita, it varies enormously among nations. If we look from richest to poorest, we see a very large gap. Finally, we see both what we call growth miracles and growth disasters in the world. Some countries have grown really rapidly. These are what we call our growth miracles. But then we've seen some countries that have stagnated, our growth disasters. So being able to explain why one country might be a growth miracle while another country is a growth disaster is certainly something important to development economists. We can see some evidence of these three key facts in maps and graphs that I'm about to show you. So let's take a quick look. First, we've got GDP per capita in real US dollars. So look at the vertical axis. By real US dollars, we're simply saying let's take out the inflation component. We don't care that income's going up because of inflation. That doesn't make you better off, right? If we look at this graph over time, this goes back to very early history, right? And you see all of those lines are on top of each other. United States, Western Europe, Latin America, China, India, everybody. We're all basically at the same income level and we all used to be poor. So all countries basically started off poor, but let's move to the right across the years. Over time, some have fared far better, right? Look at the United States and compare that to India, and you see a drastic contrast. It's interesting to figure out why. Why has that happened? Next, this is a heat map of the world, and of course you read a heat map by looking at colors. So let's look at the very bottom, and you see that going from light color to the darkest blue tells us something about income. Darker color is wealthier in GDP per capita. Now this is 2020. So we see that there's a wide range. Let's see where we find dark blue. We find it there in North America, right? We've got the United States, we've got Alaska. We see another pocket here in Western Europe and Scandinavia. We've got this little bitty pocket here in the Middle East. I'm guessing that's United Arab Emirates and Qatar. And then there's probably a teeny tiny little portion at the very tip of that peninsula, and that is Singapore. So we see some wealthy countries, and they're spread all out, right? They're not all in one place. But the problem is, if we look at the other end of the spectrum, we see a lot of that light blue color. We see a lot of that kind of grayish blue color. Well, those are countries that haven't fared as well. As I said, even within a geographic area, we see quite a wide range. So this is the data that we've likely looked at before, and these countries are Southeast Asia, and they are ranked, and this is 2021 purchasing power parity, which means we've controlled for cost of living and what money actually buys. Look at the very top country, Singapore, super wealthy with a GDP per capita of $106,000 in purchasing power parity, all the way down to Burma, just over 4,000. We still, unfortunately, have a lot of underdeveloped nations in the world. Now, here we do see some concentration. It's very obvious that a lot of our least developed countries are located in Africa, but take a look to the right. We do see some in other locations, including Southeast Asia, right? We see an arrow pointing to Myanmar. We see an arrow pointing to Laos. We see an arrow pointing to Cambodia, and so on. The good news here is that poverty and extreme poverty, well, these are falling. What we're looking at here is percent of the entire world that's living under certain extreme poverty benchmarks or poverty benchmarks. So this is kind of like the absolute poverty idea we talked about. Are you above this level or below this level? Really good news is right here. This is the share of the world living in extreme poverty. So these are estimates from 2021, living on $2.15 a day. So that's the definition, controlled for cost of living across countries, right? So we have to kind of adjust. So this is a pretty sophisticated methodology, but don't worry about that. Just look at the line. In 1820, we had 79% of the world living in extreme poverty, but more modern day, 2018 is the most recent data we have here, it's only 9% of the world. That is progress, my friends, living in extreme poverty. Now, if we look at the next benchmark, this is the share of the world living on less than $3.65 a day. Now, that would be a more appropriate poverty line for a lower middle income country. So, Cambodia, Laos, and we see rapid transformation there. 58% in, looks like, is that 1975 or so, down to 25%. So big progress there, but guys, we still have a lot of people living below the poverty line in our lower middle income countries. This blue line, share of the world living on less than $6.85 per day, that would be a poverty line typical for an upper middle income country. So remember, we have some of those in Southeast Asia as well. We're making progress on the front of fighting poverty. That's great news. However, if we look at data broken down by geographic region, so this is similar kind of data, but this is share of people living on less than $1.25 a day. So again, extreme poverty. And this is older data. Just want to use it to point out that we still see higher rates of extreme poverty in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. I want to be clear. We're making progress. They're going down, but they're still higher than some of the other geographic parts of the world. One more interesting thing I want to point out about this graph that we looked at just a second ago. Let's look at this top benchmark, because that's a little harder to get your brain around. This is the share of people in the world living on less than $30 per day. Well, $30 per day is a lot of money in a lot of places, but it's still $11,000. So we're not talking about people being rich. What this shows us is that 84% of the world still lives on less than about $11,000 a year. So most people in the world are still poor by some measures. We do want to be clear about that. We see most countries experiencing economic growth. What do we mean by that? If we look at gross domestic product over time, controlling for inflation, it's going up. That means likely GDP per capita is also going up, meaning average incomes are going up. So economic growth is generally what we see. We see an upward sloping line when we look at gross domestic product over time. And some have made incredible progress. We deem these growth miracles. So those countries that are outliers, that are just growing at an incredible rate, more than standard, more than normal, those are our growth miracles. One good example is China. China has seen some very big rates of economic growth. Look at that trajectory and you see how steep it is. This is gross domestic product purchasing power parity. So the size of the economy controlling for inflation is increasing rapidly for China. Economic growth for China has exceeded those of other countries, and that's why that line has such a steep pitch to it. So you would deem China a growth miracle. Chile is another one. We've seen this boom in Chile. Look at this graph. Look where it turns red in 1975. We see rapidly increasing, and this is GNP, gross national product. Don't worry about any differences, but it's per capita, so we're talking about kind of the average income measure that we've talked about with GDP per capita. 1975, they just take off. Huge growth. And poverty was reduced drastically. Poverty rates went from 50% to 11%. So Chile, another growth miracle. Singapore. Look at Singapore's transformation. Singapore broke away from the pack back in the 80s and the 90s. So I tried to indicate that with my red arrow, right? They're kind of together, a little bit more together, and then all of a sudden, boom, Singapore takes out of the gate, right? Like a racehorse. And it has been an amazing Southeast Asian success story. They saw higher rates of economic growth than other Asian countries, even the successful ones. They outperformed Japan, which at one point was described as a growth miracle just a few decades ago. So Singapore, a true Southeast Asian success story. Unfortunately, we also have growth disasters, right? We see some countries that are just not growing successfully. In fact, some have actually retreated. In other words, they are in economic decay, they're worse off. So a growth disaster could be just not seeing much growth or actually becoming worse off, economically decaying. These are what we've termed growth disasters. Here's two. We've got Nigeria in the top panel. Look at how it's not really an upward trend in their GDP per capita over time. It's just been really stagnant. And then look at the bottom panel where you see Zambia. It's actually a decrease in GDP per capita. Clearly growth disasters. Adding one more, and this one I'm comparing to Thailand. Thailand seeing good rates of economic growth. Look at Ghana in Africa. Very stagnant. That GDP per capita is basically flat. Again, another growth disaster. We have to ask ourselves the question, is it about natural resources? In other words, do growth miracles happen because countries just have more natural resources? The answer is clearly no. Economists would agree with this. If it was about natural resources, folks, Burma would be rich, Africa would be rich. Burma's got a lot of natural resources. Africa has a lot of natural resources, yet neither one is rich. So it can't be about natural resources. So having natural resources clearly is not sufficient to guarantee wealth. Just having them doesn't mean you're going to be wealthy. Not saying it doesn't help, but it doesn't guarantee your wealth. Also, natural resources are not necessary in order to have wealth. You can be wealthy without them. An example is Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a very wealthy country. It doesn't have a very large stock of natural resources. Natural resources are nice. I'm not trying to say that they don't have a role, but they don't explain prosperity. Again, if they did, Burma would be rich, African nations would be rich, and we don't see that. There are other economic resources that are important too. We've talked about human capital. It's important to educate and train your people. That gives you more productive labor. Physical capital is important. We haven't talked yet about physical capital, but physical capital are those things that are man-made. They're physical, meaning I can reach out and touch them, and they're assets that are reusable in the production process. So access to machinery, computers, your trucks, those could be all physical capital. So having access to physical capital is also important, but even this is not enough to explain wealth. If they're the only things you've got going on, it's not going to be enough. They do play a role, but again, they don't explain prosperity. The reason is that we care about institutions. You have to have good institutions. You could have all the natural resources in the world. If you have bad institutions, you're not going to be prosperous. It just is how it works. Institutions are important, and as I've said, a country is only as good as its institutions. So what are institutions? Because I keep saying institutions matter. A country is only as good as its institutions. Institutions are well-established arrangements and structures that are part of the culture or society. So well-established arrangements and structures that are part of the culture or society. They're going to shape what life will be like for a country's citizens. So well-established arrangements and structures that are part of the culture or society, and they're going to determine what your life is like. For example, life in North Korea is heavily influenced by the institutions that are present. Now, if I asked you, does North Korea have very good institutions? My guess is you don't even need to know much about institutions to say no. North Korea doesn't have very good institutions, and as a result, its citizens suffer. Now, we're going to divide the idea of institutions into three categories. We're going to talk about political institutions, we're going to talk about economic institutions, and we're going to talk about legal institutions. So political, economic, and legal. There are probably social institutions as well, and some other disciplines might go into that. We're not going to, but probably those also do matter. Development economists agree that institutions are key. They're going to set the incentives for society. They kind of determine the rules of the game in a sense. And they also determine if the environment is conducive to activities that benefit the economy. In other words, does it attract activities that benefit the economy? Does it encourage activities that benefit the economy? Or is the environment one that deters these types of good activities? The things that we know are good, we've talked about them a little bit. Investments in human capital, again, not the only thing that matters, but we've argued that it does matter. Development of contracts, trade, foreign direct investment, and these are just to name a few. So we'll talk more about specific institutions, but you've already learned about some of these already. It would be hard to determine which institutions are most important. As a whole, you need to have good institutions, but it would be hard for me to say, look, you got to do A, B, C. Those are the three most important things, because it really depends on what country we're talking about. These can be really case specific. A certain country might need more of one kind of institution, and that might be more important for them. But what we do know is that prosperous nations, those that are prosperous, have institutions that look different than the institutions in those nations that aren't prosperous. So if we make a comparison, prosperous versus not prosperous, we're going to see different institutions. We're going to see that they're not the same. And a good example of this is North Korea versus South Korea. One is not prosperous, one is prosperous. And if we make a comparison, we're going to see that the types of institutions they have, which basically dictates what life is going to be like for their citizens, well, they are going to be very different. So in part 2, we're going to go into detail about the different institutions. So I'll see you in part 2.